Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a really fascinating book, A World of Insecurity, Democratic Disenchantment in Rich and Poor Countries. It's by Pranab Bardhan, came out in 2022.
Yeah, it's a book that really tries to get to the heart of some major global issues right now. Our mission, really, is to unpack its core arguments. It looks at the huge impact of uncertainty, insecurity on, political and economic systems everywhere.
Especially on democracy itself.
Exactly, on the democratic state.
And it looks at how these pressures affect social coordination, the beliefs underneath it all, locally and globally, and even considers some, well, policy ideas. The author uses this phrase, upbeat skepticism.
Right, acknowledging things are tough, but still pushing for ways to improve.
Yeah, and it's not just about the pandemic's immediate effects, is it? It's looking at longer-term systemic problems democracies face.
That's a core focus. So yeah, let's dig in.
Absolutely. So where does the source start with the state of democracy globally? What's the kind of the big picture?
Well, it paints a pretty stark picture, actually. The source highlights significant democratic backsliding pretty much everywhere. Latin America, for example, is apparently back to early 1990s levels.
Wow, the 90s. That's a long way back.
It is. And Eastern Europe, Central Asia, they're reportedly at post-Soviet Union lows.
Okay, so widespread decline. And the source mentions India specifically.
It does, and this is quite striking. It notes that India, the world's biggest democracy by population, nearly 1.4 billion people, is now described by some sources as an electoral autocracy.
Electoral autocracy. That's a really loaded term. What's the justification given?
It's attributed to, a severe shrinking of space for the media, for civil society groups, for political opposition, all under the current government. It's like the machinery of democracy is being hollowed out from the inside.
And is this finding unique to this source, or are others seeing this too?
No, it seems to be part of a wider pattern. The source mentions other big democracy measures: American Enterprise Institute, Economist Intelligence Unit, Freedom House, the Polity Data Series. They're all reporting similar global trends. Democratic decline is, unfortunately, a theme.
So it's a consistent finding. How is this decline actually happening? What are the mechanisms?
The source points to intensifying attacks on really core freedoms, expression, assembly, protest, plus direct assaults on key institutions: the media, universities, civil society groups. And crucially, the quality of elections themselves is going down.
And you mentioned who's on for Canada and who is often behind this. It's not always the classic military coup anymore.
No, and this is a key point the source really hammers home, drawing on folks like Levitsky and Ziblatt. Increasingly, it's elected leaders carrying out these attacks. That's the tragic paradox it talks about.
Right, using democracy's own tools against it.
Exactly. Using the institutions gradually, subtly, often legally to kill democracy. Like that frog being slowly boiled. It doesn't notice until it's too late.
That's a really disturbing image, using the system against itself. Who are some examples this source gives?
It mentions leaders like Viktor Orban in Hungary, Narendra Modi in India, Vladimir Putin in Russia, Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. It even suggests the U.S. had a, quote, narrow escape in 2020.
Thanks to institutions holding, just about.
Yeah, battered but resilient institutions, though the source definitely implies future doubts remain.
Okay, so democratic backsliding, often driven by elected leaders. And right alongside this, we've seen this massive wave of populism over the last decade or so. The source lists quite a few examples.
Oh, it's a long list. Brazil under Bolsonaro, Hungary with Orban, India with Modi, Philippines under Duterte, Poland's PAPE party, Russia, Slovenia under Janjaya, Turkey, the UK with Brexit, the U.S. with Trump.
And strong opposition parties too, right? France, Italy, Germany.
Exactly. Rassemblement National in France, Lega Nord and Fratelli d'Italia in Italy, the AfD in Germany. It's a global phenomenon.
The word populism can be slippery, though. How is the source defining it here?
It mainly goes with the political science definition. Basically, a leader claims to represent the true will of the people.
And uses that claim to bypass rules and institutions.
Precisely. Trampling on due process, ignoring representative government structures. The source distinguishes this from just, short-term economic populism, and notes this political definition fits most of the right-wing examples it gives.
Okay, so it's a style of politics, a way of governing, that's hostile to established democratic norms. Why? Why is this rising now? What does this source see as the root cause?
This is really central to the book's argument. It argues pretty strongly that the roots lie less in economic inequality itself, though that's part of the story, and more in widespread insecurity.
Insecurity, okay,
Yeah.
and it breaks that down.
Yes, into two main types: economic insecurity and cultural insecurity. And economic insecurity here isn't just about income or jobs, though that's obviously huge. It's also the feeling of precariousness about pensions, healthcare, social safety nets, the future feeling unstable.
And there's data backing this feeling up, right? That sense of decline.
Yeah, some striking numbers. A 2017 Pew survey found a median of 53% in Europe and North America thought their children would be financially worse off than them.
Over half.
Yeah, and in France, it was almost 70%. Compare that to India at 16% or Nigeria at 49%. The pessimism is much stronger in richer countries.
And that ties into things like social mobility declining, too.
Exactly. The source mentions Chetty's research in the U.S. showing the chances of earning more than your parents dropped significantly between the 1980 and 1990 cohorts. It feeds that sense that the ladder's been pulled up.
What's interesting, though, is the source notes some of these right-wing populist parties haven't actually gone after welfare states aggressively.
That's a really key observation. In places like France, Germany, India, Poland, Turkey, some right-wing parties haven't seriously weakened worker welfare. The source suggests this kind of neutralizes the traditional economic appeal of the left to some extent.
So the economic anxiety is real, but maybe it's being channeled differently.
That seems to be the argument. Even on redistribution, Piketty's data showed Le Pen voters in France supported taking from the rich almost as much as Macron voters. Less than the far left, sure, but it shows the economic grievance doesn't automatically lead left. It suggests the political energy is often harnessed through, well, the other type of insecurity.
Cultural insecurity, okay. How does the source describe that, and how does it link up with the economic side?
It argues they're often deeply intertwined, and that cultural insecurity is something the right have been very effective at exploiting. There's this popular resentment, not just against the super rich, but often more intensely against the professional and cultural elite.
This sort of us versus them feeling based on values or lifestyle.
Precisely. What gets called the culture wars. And these conflicts, the source argues, often tend to favor the Vorts, right? Immigration is a huge one in Europe and the U.S. Religious fanaticism is a major factor in places like Brazil, India, Turkey.
And there's a psychological dimension, too, about status.
Yes, that feeling of status insecurity, anxiety about your group's diminishing standing. The source suggests this can lead to aggression towards perceived outsider groups, especially in places facing economic decline, where people feel a strong need to preserve their community identity and hierarchies.
The source mentions a French study contrasting voters, Le Pen versus Mélenchon.
Right, from the 2017 election. It found Le Pen voters typically had very low interpersonal trust. Mélenchon voters, often with similar low incomes, expressed similar misery, but had more trust and wanted the government to fix injustice. It suggests different ways of processing grievance.
And that theme of distrust, distrust in government, in institutions, that seems pervasive.
Absolutely. It's at historical lows in many places. U.S. data, OECD data, World Values Survey, they all show declining trust in government. And interpersonal trust is often lowest in highly unequal countries like Brazil or South Africa.
Which fuels hostility towards the system, bureaucrats, politicians, experts.
Exactly. The deep state narrative. Slogans like "take back control" tap right into that feeling. In developing countries, politicians are often widely seen as corrupt. That Pew India survey, finding 2/3 seeing politicians as corrupt, is telling. So people become deeply skeptical of any program run by that bureaucracy.
Does that push them towards other organizations?
Often, yes. Religious charities, for instance, might be perceived as more trustworthy or effective at delivering basic help. And if they're affiliated with populist right parties, that builds a connection, contrasting with perceived corrupt or uncaring state officials.
Going back to immigration, the source seems to argue the cultural tension is key, regardless of the economic arguments.
Yes, the cultural dimension is presented as primary, and perception is way off from reality often. People in the U.S. and Western Europe tend to think the immigrant population is 2 or 3 times what it actually is.
And negative views aren't always correlated with actual numbers.
Right. The source notes anti-immigrant sentiment, like AfD support in Eastern Germany, can be higher where there are fewer immigrants. It suggests anxiety, maybe fueled by media stories about job losses elsewhere, creates a general insecurity that latches onto immigration as a symbol.
Is there a specific focus on Muslim immigrants in Europe?
Yes, the source points that out. Perceived cultural differences, Islamophobic stereotypes, narratives like the Great Replacement, these are potent. It even mentions terms like Islamo-leftism in French politics. Le Pen, for example, apparently softened some economic policies, but really hardened her stance on Islam and immigration.
And this connects to the idea of manufactured victimhood.
That's a really important concept the source discusses.
Yeah.
How a sense of victimhood can be cultivated within majority groups. Hindu victimhood in India is compared to white victimhood narratives in Europe, US, a feeling of lost entitlement. The source mentions suspicions about groups like the RSS infiltrating police military in India, potentially enabling nationalist acts.
Like the suspicions about white supremacists in U.S. law enforcement.
Exactly, mentioning their presence in the Jan 6 riots as an example. The point is, leaders actively stoke these feelings in majority communities. Hindus feeling endangered by Muslims in India, Muslims by Kurds in Turkey, Hungarians fearing non-existent immigrants.
And this creates a tension with democratic processes.
A huge tension. Mobilized followers, fired up by these feelings, become impatient with due process, minority rights, affirmative action. They want a strong leader to just push through the majority's perceived will.
Which leads us to thinking about the balance between community, market, and state. The source looks at bringing power back to the local community level, right? As a response to state and market failures.
It does explore that idea. The advantages are clear. Using local knowledge, building on trust, more bottom-up decision-making.
Sounds good in theory, but the source warns against communitarian romanticism. What's the danger?
The big danger is capture. Small, local institutions can actually be more easily dominated by local elites. Oligarchs, powerful families, dominant castes, even white supremacists in the U.S. South, or the mafia in Sicily. Outside intervention, often from the state, is sometimes needed to protect people from the local community structure.
Ambedkar's quote about the Indian village comes to mind.
Exactly. He called it a sink of localism, a den of ignorance, narrow-mindedness, and communalism. For marginalized groups, the source argues, the anonymity of the market or the intervention of a distant state with impersonal rules can actually be preferable, a form of protection.
But communities can be effective sometimes, in specific ways.
Oh, absolutely. Group ties and social sanctions can enforce agreements really effectively, sometimes more cheaply than formal contracts. Think of those examples like Chinese lineage businesses in Hong Kong or Gujarati families in the U.S. motel industry. The trust is built in.
There are limits.
Yeah, these relation-based systems often struggle to scale up, especially when you need external finance or professional management outside the close-knit group.
And there's that potential clash between the group and the individual.
Definitely. Traditional community support, like kids caring for parents, relies on social obligation that provides security, but it can also limit individual freedom, the choice to live differently. Liberals might prefer state-backed social security for that reason, and sometimes group rights get invoked to suppress individual expression if a group feels offended. Liberty and fraternity, they can really conflict. Gandhi, a champion of local community, was apparently less keen on some aspects of liberalism.
So, tying this back, what's the role for social democratic organizations here?
The source sees a crucial task. They need to counter those negative race-to-the-bottom community or nationalist impulses. They need to try and recapture some of that local cultural ground from the populists, being sensitive to genuine community needs and the cultural alienation many workers feel from more cosmopolitan liberals.
Okay, let's shift gears to another big theme. The lure of authoritarianism, especially looking at governance, comparing China and India. We hear a lot about needing a strong state for development or crises.
Yes, but the source is careful here. State strength doesn't automatically mean authoritarianism. It points to successful democracies like Germany, South Korea, Denmark, Sweden. They've shown you can have a very effective, strong state within a democratic framework.
So how does the source define that strength?
Two main things. One is political centralization, the ability to create order across the country, override local resistance, and build up fiscal and legal capacity nationwide. Studies apparently link this to better public goods and growth. The second is the capacity for credible commitments, resisting interest group pressure, enforcing budgets, not constantly bailing out failures, like East Asian states withdrawing support for infant industries when the time was right.
Makes sense. Capacity and consistency. So comparing China and India using this lens,
Right.
What about internal organization, that idea of political meritocracy?
China's often held up as an example of meritocracy leading to economic success. But the source asks, well, who defines merit? In China, it's largely the CCP elite. That might not align with what the wider population, especially in places like Tibet or Xinjiang, would see as merit. And there's very little downward accountability to the people. It's mostly upward to the party.
Whereas democracy is supposed to have that public discussion defining goals and accountability.
Exactly. treating citizens as participants, not just subjects. China's system might give its bureaucracy an edge in balancing performance and loyalty compared to, say, India or the US, where loyalty can sometimes trump basic competence. In India, the source mentions bureaucrats getting shuffled around for political loyalty or being tempted by post-retirement jobs, which discourages investing in expertise or encourages corruption related to postings.
But corruption isn't unique to one system.
Oh, absolutely not. The source notes corruption exists in China too, sometimes vertically connected across provinces. India, it says, tends to have more public scrutiny from media and activists. But, and this is a big one, but that scrutiny is increasingly being misused by those at the top against opponents, and large parts of the media have become quite compliant.
What about regulatory bodies, the watchdogs?
They need expertise and independence. The source argues that independence is often seriously lacking in China, which makes the state's commitment to its own regulations less credible over time.
And innovation. China seems like a powerhouse, but state control must have downsides.
It's a trade-off. Huge market for things like AI.
Yes. But the lack of openness, constraints on critical thinking, lack of diversity, those are big disadvantages for certain kinds of creativity. The state promotes national champions, but then seems to get nervous if they get too big or independent.
Like the clampdowns on Jack Ma and others. Exactly. Ant, Alibaba, Didi, Tencent. It shows the uncertainty private tech faces. The source questions if China truly allows for Schumpeter's creative destruction, pointing to relatively few companies actually going bust.
And the link between business and politics. The source says it's particularly strong in India.
Very strong, apparently. States that around half the ruling party MPs are businessmen, about a quarter overall. They bring campaign cash. Corporate donations are huge but opaque. That anonymous electoral bond system, now gone, was a prime example. There are widespread suspicions that crony oligarchs donate heavily and get regulatory favors in return loans, tax breaks, weaker rules.
How does that compare to China?
Chinese tycoons face their own precarity. Disloyalty to the party can be punished harshly. But the source suggests Indian politicians might be even more reliant on business money just to get elected.
This brings us neatly to what the source calls the slippery slope of majoritarianism. What's the core conflict here?
It's that fundamental tension between procedural democracy, the rules, due process, protecting minorities and majoritarian communities who get impatient with those rules when they feel blocked.
And these communities can end up enabling the erosion of institutions.
Yes, that's the argument. Especially where institutions like the judiciary or police are already weak, majoritarian communities can become complicit when their leaders undermine institutional independence. Winning the next election through mobilizing the majority becomes the priority, sometimes over defending the rules themselves.
So you need more than just competing factions. You need strong institutional guardrails.
Precisely. A structure designed to uphold civil rights, not just manage power struggles. The source suggests if different elite groups fear each other, they might agree on a social contract ensuring basic rights for all, kind of like Rawls's veil of ignorance.
And what makes that contract stick?
The classic elements: a constitution, separation of powers, checks and balances, independent watchdogs, judiciary, media, universities, civil society. They're meant to prevent the abuse of power.
Looking at India again, the source points to weaknesses in these safeguards.
It does. Revisiting the suspicion of RSS infiltration in police army, suggesting compromised impartiality. A climate of fear silencing civil society. Unions in decline. The judiciary seen as often timid. Opposition parties described as disorganized.
And central government actions described as undermining the structure.
Yes, things like arbitrarily reorganizing states, overriding federal powers on policing or welfare, changing finance commission terms, questionable election funding. The source notes these moves are often technically legal, using loopholes or majorities, which highlights that legality doesn't always mean legitimacy.
What's the way back, according to the source?
Effective organized opposition is key in legislatures, media, streets, state governments. It mentions Gandhi's ideas on civil disobedience against unjust laws. Movements need both spark and structure organizations, common goals, leaders to last, citing the farmers' protest as an example of sustained pressure. But it's framed as a real uphill battle for liberal democracy globally. Its vulnerability, its Achilles heel to being hollowed out from within, is really exposed right now.
So given all these deep-seated problems, the source revisits social democracy, not as a nostalgic throwback, but as something adaptable.
Exactly. It's presented as an old idea needing significant updates for today's technology and capitalism. But its core appeal, the source suggests, is trying to balance values, liberty, equality, fraternity with the mechanisms we use, state, market, and community.
But the traditional vehicles for social democracy parties, unions, they've been weakening for decades.
That's a huge challenge acknowledged head-on. Union membership in the OECD halved since 1980. Automation, globalization hitting traditional jobs, reduced faith in unions, plus active campaigns against them, like right-to-work laws or using contract labor.
And this decline helped open the door for populists.
The source argues yes. Less union protection, inadequate social insurance buffering trade shocks, combined with resentment, xenophobia, distrust of experts, and that majoritarian impatience with rules. It created an opening. Plus, corruption scandals hurt some traditional left parties too.
How does the pandemic aftermath fit into this? Does it change the calculus for social democracy?
Well, the pandemic made a lot of things worse. Inequality deepened, the poor were hit hardest living conditions, vaccine access, job losses, small business failures, the digital divide, damaged education. Economic insecurity ramped up everywhere.
But any potential opportunities arising from it?
Maybe. Heightened insecurity could boost demand for domestic jobs and production. Geopolitics and the pandemic might slightly weaken globalization, maybe leading to more diversified supply chains, though the source doubts a full retreat from trade. Trade is vital, but it needs strong social insurance for the losers. Without it, it's incredibly disruptive.
And opportunities for labor movements specifically?
Possibly. The focus on essential workers could spark organizing in retail services.
Yeah.
There's also much greater awareness now of the vulnerability of informal workers in developing countries, who are the majority there.
Could this help bridge that gap between formal and informal workers?
The source thinks so. Common demands like universal health care or universal basic income, UBI, could unite both groups, potentially strengthening the broader labor movement.
Okay, that brings us to the policy options the book explores to actually relieve insecurity. Let's start with jobs. The picture painted is pretty bleak globally, isn't it?
It really is. Vanishing or inadequate jobs, especially for youth. U.S. Rust Belt, developing world cities. Youth unemployment is terrifyingly high, in some places 60% in Africa, over 23% for young adults in India recently. That example of 19 million applying for 63,000 basic railway jobs in India. It just shows the massive gap between the demand for decent, formal jobs and the supply.
And the old model of shifting workers from farms to factories isn't working everywhere.
Not like it did in East Asia. In Africa and India, it hasn't absorbed enough labor, so many remain in low productivity informal work. India's done well in high-skill sectors, sure, but overall you have loads of tiny, struggling firms alongside islands of success.
So what policy ideas does the source float to tackle this?
Several things. Mass skill formation, continuous learning moving beyond rote learning, vocational training linked to apprenticeships seems promising, though rare Germany, California examples are mentioned, subsidized training within firms, public support for unions, fighting for wages and dignity.
What about more direct government action?
Definitely. Things like restructuring loans for small businesses, providing customized support services, tech, management, marketing help, and big public investments in infrastructure, social housing, digital connectivity.
It sounds like the source is calling for a much more active state role in job creation itself.
Yes, arguing that given the huge social costs of unemployment, the state needs to lead, provide vision, take risks, share risks to actively foster productive jobs. This means rebuilding public sector capacity that's been eroded by austerity and privatization and new forms of public-private partnership.
And there was that idea about redirecting innovation.
Yeah, that's a fascinating, though challenging idea. Could social democracy push innovation away from just replacing labor or chasing short-term profit? Towards tech that's labor-absorbing, empowering, customized, maybe focused on green or health goals. Right now, big tech AI research often focuses on substitution and state research on surveillance.
So changing the direction of R&D.
It's exactly. Acemoglu and Restrepo are cited on how corporate concentration and tax biases distort research. It's a big ask for labor movements to influence this, but potentially crucial. And in developing countries, using public finance to adapt tech to local needs and labor. AI could help farming or free up nurses for better tasks if steered right.
Let's talk UBI, Universal Basic Income, always controversial. What's the rationale here, especially for developing countries?
The main idea is a basic floor of economic security. For developing countries, the source highlights avoiding the errors of targeted programs. India's BPL scheme, for example, missed lots of poor people and included non-poor ones. UBI gives to everyone, so you don't miss the poor. It might be easier to claw back from the rich than accurately find all the poor.
How could it possibly be funded?
By cutting regressive subsidies that often help the rich more, and by taxing the rich more. If funded progressively, it could be redistributive overall, like U.S. Social Security.
How does it affect the link between jobs and security?
It kind of decouples them. Having a basic income makes losing a job less catastrophic. The source suggests it might even encourage risk-taking, starting a business, getting training, holding out for a better job, because you have that safety net.
Any other benefits mentioned? Social ones?
Yeah, boosting autonomy for women doing unpaid care work
Right.
if the UBI goes directly to them, framing it as a basic citizenship right, replacing dependence on political favors.
And bridging that informal labor divide.
Potentially, yes. In countries where most workers are informal, UBI and universal health care could be common demands that unite everyone, strengthening labor's voice.
What about the usual objections? People will stop working.
The source says the evidence from actual experiments doesn't really support that strongly. Often there's a small positive effect on work, as people use the security to find better work or start something themselves.
But the cost must be enormous. Financial viability.
That's the huge question, absolutely. It depends on the level. A full living wage UBI might be impossible, but the source suggests a decent supplement could be feasible in some poorer countries. But it requires new taxes. India's tax base is low, property tax collection is poor, no wealth or inheritance tax. A rough calculation suggests even a 1% wealth tax on the super rich could raise significant funds.
And there's public support for things like wealth taxes.
Apparently, yes, even among some Republicans in the U.S. And global efforts on tax transparency are making wealth taxes potentially more feasible. The OECD G20 minimum corporate tax is a start, though maybe not enough benefit for developing countries yet.
Of course, there's the argument that money could be better spent elsewhere, education, health.
Absolutely. The source acknowledges that's a perfectly valid debate. UBI is one option among many.
Okay, let's look at decentralization, tying back to that take back control idea.
Yeah, empowering local levels. There are potential upsides, participatory budgeting in Brazil, apparently increased health spending, empowered citizens. Digital tools in Reykjavik, Estonia, Taiwan offer other models.
But we also talked about the dangers of local capture.
Exactly, that's the major drawback highlighted again. Local elites, oligarchs, dominant groups can easily take over. U.S. South, Indian villages, Sicily. The risk of corruption is high without checks.
So safeguards are absolutely vital. What kind?
Things like genuinely contested local elections, full budget transparency, easy access to information, and strong oversight citizen councils, yes, but also independent judiciary, auditors, media watching closely.
And local governments need the ability to raise their own money, which is often lacking.
Hugely lacking. Property tax collection is often abysmal in places like Latin America or India. Poor records, complex rules, exemptions, corruption. The source calls for a complete overhaul. Clear powers, computerization, GIS mapping, better valuation methods, regular updates, transparency.
Thinking bigger picture, again, international coordination, the source argues this is essential to avoid a race to the bottom in many areas.
Absolutely critical across the board. Trade. Revive the WTO. Focus on multilateralism, which helps poorer countries more. Fix the dispute settlement system. Adapt rules for digital trade, green energy, supply chains. Reform ISDS so corporations can't undermine domestic standards so easily. Reform intellectual property, TRIPS, so it doesn't stifle innovation or access.
What about international tax?
Need agreements against tax evasion, money laundering, tax havens, including those within rich countries like Delaware. The OECD is pushing. That 15% minimum corporate tax is a step, but developing countries need more, maybe higher rates, fair allocation of profits, especially from digital giants.
And coordinating on labor and environment.
Yes. Enforcing core ILO labor standards, penalizing union busting. For the environment, things like global carbon pricing, maybe with revenue shared per capita, proper accounting for emissions embedded in traded goods, a new international body for climate finance and green projects.
Immigration coordination, too.
Suggestions like schemes matching immigrants to specific skill shortages, nursing, caregiving in rich countries, maybe funding training centers in poorer countries to supply those skills, allowing controlled migration that also benefits the home country, mitigating brain drain.
And holding corporations accountable internationally?
Yes. Agreements to ensure accountability for human rights abuses by multinationals down the supply chain and coordinated action against major cyber attacks.
Finally, circling back to the cultural aspect, the source argues labor organizations need to re-engage culturally, not just economically.
Yes, this is presented as really important. Step into that cultural space populists have occupied. Move beyond just wages and conditions. Get involved in local cultural life, neighborhoods, maybe even religious groups like unions used to do in some places. This could help counter nativism and prejudice.
So the decline of unions created a cultural void, too.
That's the argument. It wasn't just lost economic power, but also a loss of belonging, community, meaning for many workers. Young people looking for purpose can get drawn into extremist groups, alt-right, jihadists, Hindu militants. Labor and the left need to offer something positive and inclusive instead. Just focusing on policy isn't enough.
But balancing different group interests must be tricky.
Incredibly tricky, but the source says it's necessary. Need openness to majority workers while being sensitive to their anxieties. Frame economic justice as benefiting everyone, as common citizenship goals, not favoring one group over another. Avoid that cutting lines perception. It requires finesse, compromise, but the source thinks it's possible. So just to kind of pull it all together, we've gone through the source's analysis of democratic backsliding, the rise of populism driven by deep economic and cultural insecurity. We look at the tricky interplay of state, market, community.
Right, and the governance challenges comparing systems like China and India, the dangers of majoritarianism undermining democratic rules.
Exactly. And then exploring potential ways forward, adapting social democracy for today. Specific policies around jobs, UBI, decentralization with safeguards, crucial international coordination, and importantly, that call for labor to re-engage in the cultural sphere.
Wow, yes, that was a very deep dive indeed, guided by Barden's analysis. It really lays bare how interconnected everything is, the economy, culture, politics, institutions.
It certainly paints a complex, challenging picture.
Thank you so much for walking us through this source material. It's a lot to process.
My pleasure. It's important stuff to grapple with.
It really is. And maybe here's something for you, the listener, to mull over based on all this. Given how deep these insecurities run, as the book describes, and how much traditional institutions like unions have been hollowed out, letting populists fill that cultural gap, are the paths forward discussed here, like adapting social democracy, strengthening labor's cultural role, are they actually enough? Or do we maybe need fundamentally new ways of thinking, new kinds of organizations to truly rebuild that trust and security this book finds so lacking?
Something to definitely think about as you navigate your own world of information.
That's all for this deep dive.